imperial army of glorified Rome. Oh, those were exciting days indeed. Whereas I enjoy my retirement now, occasionally I dress up in all my garb because I kind of miss that, you know. I'm now on my family farm raising olives, you know, and it's kind of quiet, boring actually. I often miss the glamour of traveling the world for imperial Rome. But not on any ships, mind you. No, sir. I would much rather march or ride a horse for hours, days, don't matter. Ships, no. As a soldier, I served throughout the empire. From Rome all the way to Naples, and even as far away as Egypt, before finally being assigned to the duty in Palestine. I moved up through the ranks, as I was happy to, became a centurion and record speed, a commander of 100 men, would you believe it? Now you think that's probably not a problem, but can you imagine 100 wifeless men and trying to keep those all corralled? Yeah. It takes a lot of fortitude. But I discovered it takes more ignorance than fortitude, let me tell you. Okay? Well, I was stationed in the imperial garrison there at Caesarea, and then retired to home, tending to my olive groves, my family farm, and raising pigs. Yeah. It was not a very rigorous life, to be sure, but, you know, it was something we had to do. We didn't want to lose the farm, and, you know, it had been in the name for so many years. But I really do miss the travel that I was fortunate to have in the Roman army. I wanted to visit the Orient or perhaps Africa someday. But I guess that's not going to happen now. Now I live only a few miles from Rome. So if I get too bored with old country life, I'm just a few hours away from the metropolitan area and all the excitement of the city. And then, of course, when it gets too hot and, you know, the vines, the olive branches start to wither, we're only a few miles to the west to the Mediterranean Sea where we can sunbathe and enjoy the water. It's great. It's a lovely region to retire in, to be sure. But you said you have a particular interest of the time when I was stationed in Jerusalem. And about this Jesus, the Nazarene, right? Well, I see. I suspect that you might be followers of the way. But that's okay. You know, I've heard a great deal about this Messianic sect. I mean, even here in Rome. I mean, news travels rather quickly, to be sure, and Pontius Pilate himself had returned here to Rome under the disgrace of the emperor, I might add. Fortunately, I was not involved in that Pilate scandal, so was not part of that dishonoring that he went through. I could have been involved in that scandal, and thank the Lord I wasn't. Well, he ended up on the wrong side of the emperor, that's for sure. Although my company and I were really originally stationed in Caesarea. That's the city on the Mediterranean coast next to Israel. We were dispatched to the fortress Antonio. You know who that fortress was named after, right? Mark Antony, of course. The great Roman general that made the world his backyard? Oh, yeah. Well, the Jews, they were a curious lot. Unlike us Romans or even the Greeks, they believed in only one God. Would you believe it? I thought their spirituality was somewhat bankrupt. Instead of all the many shrines and all the innumerable holidays we Romans would have, they had but one temple in Jerusalem, and a few or handful of feasts that they celebrated. If not bankrupt, though, they seemed to be somewhat shortchanged when it came to their religion, I thought. At least based on our standards. Let me see. Their new year, I think, started in the autumn of the year, as I recall. And in the spring every year they would celebrate a major festival. I think they called it Passover. It recalls their escape from, I think, the country Egypt. Many years ago, of course, before they moved into the Promised Land and took possession of the land that they say God had promised them. They had several exceptional generals to bring that all about. They were not always a conquered people who were under rulership of another nation. One of the generals I read about was Joshua. Yeah. We have been long favorites and interested in his exploits. And then, of course, there was David, the king who really was a military tactician. Unbelievable. Surprisingly, even the Jews had military geniuses in their day. But back to my story. We were concerned that the Jews would try to be roped. Okay? They were, what shall I say? An obstinate people. Yeah. With so much pride and arrogant demeanor that few of us Romans could stomach them. At first, I took exception to their better-than-thou kind of attitude. But the more I observed and became aware of their customs, I discovered a kind of spiritual pride that I really envied. A unique cultural loyalty that they had that we Romans did not have. I became convinced that I had a great deal to do with their religious faith that the Jews observed. So I spent a considerable amount of time reading and studying and even acting and living as one of them for a time. As I said, I was intrigued. I wondered what would cause a man to live as they do. I mean, to believe as they believed. And to be so deeply loyal to seemingly a lost cause. So I emulated them for a while, lived as if I were a Jew. Now, mind you, I only did it for a short time. The dietary laws were way too strict for me. Can you imagine never eating pork? And me raising pigs? Come on. And having to comply with all those fussy regulations that the Jews all had? It was ridiculous. It was worse than being in the army. Yeah, okay. It was really not a discipline that I found would bring out the best in people. No. I must say, though, however, that there was more substance to their beliefs than all the myths and religious practices of us Romans, okay? There were those unique scriptures that the Jews venerated, which we, of course, did not have, and because we had so many gods and goddesses in the Roman pantheon and Mount Olympus, it just was kind of overkill, I think. Well, the Jews were both an exclusive and elusive people. They forbade non-Jews from entering their temple. And even their synagogues were sanctuaries where Romans could very limited enter. So unfortunately, even for me, I couldn't view it firsthand. They had their belief that a God would one day send, what do they call it? Oh yeah, Messiah, okay? A kind of ruling redeemer or savior. One who would rescue them from all of their predicaments and again set up their nation in peace and prosperity and so on. Well, they fiercely believed in this idea of a coming Messiah. And every now and then, some guy from the country or the city or some fanatic would rise up and declare himself to be the Messiah, the promised long ago. And us Romans would have to come in and quell that uprising and put them all in prison and crucified a few of them. There was one particular, quote, Messiah that I recall rather vividly. He seemed different than all the rest that we had arrested at the time. He was not arrogant at all. In fact, there was a quality about him that I really can't quite describe. He had a very pleasant smile and great personal demeanor. He was rather charismatic with the people. And the difference, though, is that he didn't cry for death and rebellion. Oh, no. That was not the message that this, quote, Messiah brought. It said he was from Nazareth, a little city in northern Galilee. He was the one you, I think, call Jesus, the Christ, right? And he had quite a reputation, believe it or not. Another centurion, a friend of mine, told me that Jesus had healed his servant that was near to death's door. There in Capernaum, where he served. That's on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, by the Sea of Tiberias. Okay? There were other fanatic stories about his healing powers. Some said he even fed thousands of people with only a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And then they collected all that was left over, and there was more at the end than what they started with. Unbelievable. Supposedly, the story continues that he even quieted a violent storm in the Sea of Galilee for he and his disciples. And the greatest claim of them all is that in the city of Bethany, he raised a man who had been dead for 4 days. Would you believe that? Wow. Well, his preaching and teaching provided no call for violence or any kind of uprising or revolt. No. He did, though, show some concern about the extortion of money there in the temple. In fact, he went into the temple one day, close to Passover, and upturned all the money changers' tables and so forth. And he said that this house, his father's house, was to be a house of prayer. And you've all turned it into a den of thieves. Oh, yeah. Undoubtedly, he was probably correct. From what I saw going on there. There was little love for him amongst those religionists of his day. They liked their gold, oh yeah, and of course their power and position. And by using their temple money, they were exorbitantly rich. Who cared amongst them that they cheated the poor pilgrims that would come from out of town, didn't know what the exchange rate was for their money? Extortion, that's what it was. To say the least, he was not very well received, okay, by the religious authorities. I don't know what they disliked about him most, except that he never really yielded to all of their trickery and their questions that they kept putting toward him. He even once called them, believe it or not, whitewashed tombs. Now, you know what the Jews think about dead bodies, right? Oh, yeah. They don't touch them because they don't want to be contaminated or whatever. To be called whitewashed tombs? Can you believe it? Well, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and the chief priests, they arranged for him to be arrested. Even got one of his own disciples to lead him to where Jesus was. And he was eventually crucified. Where I come into the story is I was in charge of the detail there at Fortress Antonio. So when they brought this Jesus to Pilate to be judged, I and my men were around his bodyguards for Pilate to make sure he was protected. Yeah, during the trial, my men poked a little fun at this Jesus, and so on. But when you're a commander of 100 men, you got to let them have their fun from time to time. It's good for morale, right? It was kind of sadistic, I understand, but what are you going to do? But throughout all of that ordeal, Jesus pretty much kindly looked at each of us with compassion. Yes, it was a very great miscarriage of justice in my mind. But what was I to do about it? I had a command to obey. I had a job to do. I was under orders, okay? I was not there to judge either the Galilean or how Pilate handled it in his courtroom. I had a job to do, and I did it. Simple as that. So on the way to Galilee, or to Golgotha, when he stumbled carrying the cross, I just wanted to get the job done. So I grabbed any Jew I saw along the road and said, "Hey, you carry this cross now for him." I have to admit that while they drove the spikes in his hands and his feet, I always cringe at that detail. I don't know what it's like, what it's about, but it just kind of, kind of shakes me a little bit. I mean, he had done nothing wrong, either against the law of the Jews or, for that, against the Romans, as far as I could tell. He just happened to be disliked by the wrong, powerful few, and they were now having their revenge. I really don't think such a thing could happen anymore in modern-day Rome or the Roman Empire. I thought for sure our law and order was pure and above reproach, but unfortunately, that was not the case. Yes, Pilate was a weakling, to be sure. And because of his moral ineptness, my company and I had to do his dirty work. That's what I disliked the most. I spoke to one of Jesus' followers, a man by the name of John. He happened to be by the cross there, the crucifixion scene. He had been a fisherman in Galilee before he adopted the Nazarene's teachings and followed him. He told me about forgiveness for sins. For sins? Wow. And he went on to say that God desires to be reconciled with all the world. He said the Nazarene's father is God. Whoa. That his mission is to draw all sinners into fellowship with him. Now, I couldn't understand everything John was saying, but he kept talking about some prophecy being fulfilled. Whatever that referred to, I don't fully understand. And there were two others that were also crucified that day with Jesus, okay? Both of them robbers and vile people. So you can imagine, my men and I, we had our hands pretty full. Then, of course, there was crowd control. Oh, yes. We especially had to be on guard as this large and unruly mob had formed. Strange how such cruel and ongoings bring out the worst in people. Do you notice that? You see? I mean, the curious as well as the bloodthirsty, they all show up for these events. Oh, yeah. Well, my men and I had to keep pushing the Pharisees back and their adherents to get them back away where we could handle what was going on. They jeered at Jesus with a kind of circus humor. He saved others, oh yeah. But himself he cannot save, they kept saying. Or one of them shouted out, "Come down from the cross, and then we will be the first to believe that you are who you said." Yeah, right. Believe in him? Sure. Like when pigs fly? Mm-hmm. I mean, even one of the robbers reviled against Jesus and said, "Yeah, you come down from the cross." The other one, though, on his right said, whoa, wait a minute here. This man did nothing wrong. Jesus promised that he would see him again in paradise. Now think about it. He was on a cross, for crying out loud. But you know, I have to ask, what if Jesus really was who he said he was? That's really a big question, isn't it? I mean, you can have all kinds of arguments, yeah, this, that, whatever. But what if Jesus really is who he said he was? And you don't accept it. Then what? I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. No. What he said next really got me thinking. You won't believe this, but in all the agony and pain that Jesus must have been in, he is praying from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Does that make sense to you? Does that compute? Jesus asking his Father to forgive us who were putting him on that cross? I heard every word that Jesus said from the cross. And the more I heard, the more I was forced to reflect upon what I learned as I studied the Jewish scriptures. He was not the Messiah. There was an awesome sacredness in every word that he spoke from that cross. Well, at noon, the sky that day really turned dark and black, almost like night. And people began to get very afraid and worried as to what was happening in our crazy world. I heard Jesus cry from a loud voice some garbled words I didn't understand. Then I realized it was Aramaic. You know, it's the language the Jews talk. We Romans don't work with that. John reminded me or interpreted them for me. He said that Jesus was quoting an Old Testament song in Psalms. My God, why have you forsaken me? John went on to explain that this was not a call of defeat, but of deepest mortal anguish. I admit I really didn't understand what was going on or what those words meant. Well, someone offered him some sour wine to aid him in his agony, but that person was told, hey, wait, just wait and see if Elijah comes. Maybe Elijah will save him. Oh, yeah, right. And then he breathed his last. And at that instance, the whole world was as if shuddering with grief. There was this earthquake that shook and caused fissures in the ground to open up, big enough to swallow people. In fact, one zigzagged across Calvary's Hill right at the Pharisees, as if the finger of God was pointing at them. I never forget that. Should have heard them cry. Oh man, they were scared. Later, someone came running to us there on the hill, announcing that the temple curtain that separated the most holy place, would you believe it, was ripped from top to bottom during the tremor. I don't have any idea what that all meant. Well, whether it was my fright or whether it was all the facts that I had studied previously or this Jesus, things started merging together with me in a kind of sort of faith. I don't know. I cried out with a heart full of anguish more so than anything else. Truly, this man was the Son of God. I mean, certainly man was innocent, right? Well, everybody left that hill in fear and sorrow, heart sick over what they had seen happen. One of my guards took his lance and pierced Jesus' side to make sure that death was complete, okay? We weren't about to risk failing in our duty, oh no. And then a wealthy man from a little town called Arimathea, that's near the Samaritan border. I think his name was Joseph, if I'm not mistaken. He asked to bury the lifeless body of Jesus. Well, I immediately was called into Pilate's courtroom and confirmed, yes, that Jesus was actually dead. And then Pilate granted Joseph's request, and he and Nicodemus went to bury Jesus. I thought it was only an honorable thing to do, under the circumstances, of course. Well, dusk was coming rather quickly, and since the next day was the Jewish Sabbath of Passover, Joseph and Nicodemus had hastened to get Jesus off the cross and into the tomb all before sunset. It had been a terribly gruesome Friday, one that I will never ever forget. A kind of horrible prelude to the Passover festival, to be sure. Well, later my men were assigned watches guarding the tomb. It was my brave men who were dazzled by the appearance of what they said looked like an angel, okay? And discovered that the sealed tomb had been opened, and guess what? The body wasn't there. Let me tell you, they were scared blue, okay? Now, my men are good soldiers. They're not liars. They would never make up something like this. No, not in a million years, to be sure. That was the third day since the crucifixion. And of course, the chief priest got wind of what had happened and right away called my men in and tried to pay them off, saying they had fallen asleep, and that while they were sleeping, the disciples came and stole the body. Yeah, right. Well, they told me, their commanding officer, what really happened. Okay? They told me they saw the dead man, Jesus. But he wasn't dead. Okay? No, he was alive. And he walked right out of the tomb in front of them all. That's when my men became delirious and probably passed out cold at what they saw. I don't know. Only a week later, my orders were changed rather drastically. I and my men were ordered to leave for Caesarea immediately. And another detachment was sent to replace us. You know what I think happened? I think we got ordered to leave because the high priest again intimidated Pilate. Yeah. They probably thought that paying off my men was not going to be enough to hush all these events. So we were told to leave. We marched to Caesarea that very same night. It wasn't long before I was sent back to Italy. A centurion, would you mind? Do you mind? I mean, come on. With impeccable credentials. I had to report to military command. What did I do? Well, eventually I did receive an honorable discharge. But where I see it, I was forced into early retirement. Okay? Yes, they gave me a generous pension. But I will never forget the events there in Jerusalem. I still often think of them yet. As a matter of fact, I just received a letter from my cousin Cornelius the other day, who is still stationed in Caesarea. He also is a centurion, and he wrote about discovering something wonderful that he wants to share with his whole family. He referred to those perplexing days back in Jerusalem and said that it was all true. Jesus was and is alive and really is the Messiah. Someone by the name of Peter had come to his house and led him and his family to believe. They all were baptized. Did you believe it? I mean, Cornelius is a bright, careful kind of man, not easily hoodwinked. And I think this Peter, wasn't he one of Jesus' disciples? In fact, I think the one he even denied in knowing him. Well, Cornelius wrote about being baptized, he and his family, and I just find that extremely interesting. What changed Cornelius? There's still so many questions in my mind. But I must admit, rather hesitantly interested, and maybe even a little sympathetic to the way. It seems only like yesterday that all these events happened on that skull-shaped hill just outside of Jerusalem. I really should get a letter off to my cousin Cornelius and maybe ask him about what he calls the gospel. I don't know what that means. Maybe he can answer some of these questions that I have. So what questions do you have for the Roman centurion?
After all you saw, how could you not believe? Why would you still have questions?
Well, history is not very clear as far as what happened to the centurion. We know he was dispatched again from Jerusalem to Caesarea and then hauled home to Italy's command center. Okay? Another tradition says that he, with these experiences, did come to faith, but we cannot prove that or in any way certify that with other kinds of materials. So we don't know. We don't know. And so I wrote this story from the standpoint of not knowing some of those kind of things and still having questions. Trying to be as clear and real to history as we possibly can be. Okay? But you're right. I would love to have an autobiography of this centurion and what he did with his life after the crucifixion. Yeah. But it's interesting that the extra biblical materials we have, these are all Roman annals, okay? And you could access them online as well. But interestingly enough, this same centurion was responsible for the guard posting at the tomb, okay? And supposedly heard from his men what actually happened at the tomb. And there is no mistaking what they actually saw was a dead man rising, walking. Okay? Yeah. Any other questions or comments, please?
I have no question, Pastor, but very serious. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Like my crazy, everybody says I'm a great actor. It's always because I'm 99% ham. That's the only reason we can do this. Okay?
It's supposed to be ham on Easter.
Oh, it's supposed to be ham on Easter. Well, I'm in the right place at the right time. Any other comments or questions? All right, move on with our service and receive our offering, and then I'll get